On the night of January 6, 1976, three women from Kentucky, 44-year-old Louise Smith, 35-year-old Mona Stafford, and 48-year-old Elaine Thomas, decided to celebrate Stafford's birthday by driving to a restaurant in Stanford, Kentucky, which is situated nearly 30 miles away from Liberty, Kentucky, the area in which all three women lived at the time. After leaving the restaurant in Stafford at about 11:15 p.m. that night and beginning their journey home in Smith's 1967 Chevrolet, the three women, who were all sitting in the front seat, suddenly found themselves in a jackpot situation with a UFO. According to an article published in the Casey County News from Liberty, Kentucky back in February 1976, the headline reads, "It is still a mystery. Trip home was longer than usual. Casey County woman describes experiences with UFO." That article starts off with a quote. It says, "It has a force we don't have. We have nothing to fight it. God is the only one who could save us from it. With its intense heat and light, it can do whatever it wants to do." When Mona Stafford tells you she and two other local women saw and perhaps came under the power of an unidentified flying object early last month, it's difficult not to believe her. Her voice still trembles when she talks about the incident, and the swollen dark area around her eyes gives evidence she hasn't been sleeping too well recently. The day that was to end in a night of horror for Mona and her two friends was January 6th. It was Mrs. Stafford's birthday, and Louise Smith and Elaine Thomas wanted to treat her to a night out at the Redwood restaurant near Stanford. "I don't get out much," remarked Mrs. Stafford. "These two girls just wanted to do something nice for me." The trio of Casey Countians dined at the Redwood and left the restaurant at 11:15 that evening, Mona recalls. They drove through Stanford past the city cemetery and then the drive-in theater and into the open countryside. The three ladies were not too far out of Stanford when they saw something that appeared to be fire coming down from the sky. Mona, who was sitting up front between her two friends, told the driver, Louise, to drive faster toward the falling object. "It was several hundred feet ahead, and I thought it might be an airplane crashing," said Mona. As they neared the area where they had seen the fire, Mona says an object as big as a house and shaped like a blimp or football started coming down the road toward them. She said the object had red lights all the way around it, and the lights were rotating. It had a light on top that was bluish white and more brilliant than anything I've ever seen, noted Mona. The object came across the road to the right of the auto the ladies were riding in, made a half circle, and came in behind the car, Mrs. Stafford remarked. She said they turned to look at the object, but the intensity of the lights gave all of them headaches. All of a sudden, the trio realized they were no longer in control of the automobile. They felt like something was pulling back on the car. The speedometer on Louise Smith's car showed that they were traveling at 85 miles per hour, but how could that be? She didn't even have her foot on the accelerator, Mrs. Stafford said. "It felt like we were crossing those grooves they have in the road to slow you down when you're approaching a stop sign," Mona recalled. Then, all of a sudden, the women found themselves in Houstonville. However, they were shocked because none of them could remember traveling the area between the two towns. "It was like something had picked us up in Stanford and set us down in Houstonville," Mona recalled. Houstonville, by the way, is about 8 miles away from Stanford. Mrs. Stafford says that when she arrived back in Liberty at Louise Smith's house, they saw it was 1:25 a.m. It had taken the women more than 2 hours to travel to Liberty from Stanford, normally a 45-minute trip. Another strange thing the women noticed was that the two of them, Louise and Elaine, had burns on the backs of their necks. "It resembled a real bad sunburn," Mona recalled. The woman got their neighbors out of bed to see the burns and tell them about what they had seen. The neighbors advised them to separate and draw what they had seen. Mrs. Stafford's drawing showed a blimp-shaped object with the row of lights around it. In addition, many red lights, she said. There was also one yellow light that was flashing. "I think that it was a window because it was dimmer than all the other lights," she explained. The women reported their sighting to Kentucky state troopers and to the armed services, but for Mrs. Stafford, the ordeal did not end with that. "I don't feel like the same person," noted Mona. "This has just taken my mind over. I was worried about all kinds of other problems before, but this is something I just have to get a better understanding of." Mrs. Stafford, who says she can see the object now as plain as she did on the tear-filled night in Lincoln County, has been living with her parents since the incident occurred. And of course, though, that wasn't the end of the story, because some months later, the tabloid newspaper, the National Enquirer, they wanted more information about this, and so they arranged to have the three women hypnotized. And here was an article that was published in October 1976 in the National Enquirer. And this article also notes that there were some UFO researchers, like the late UFO expert Leonard Stringfield, who said at the time that this is one of the most convincing UFO cases on record. And Dr. Leo Sprinkle was brought in. Sprinkle was he was a UFO investigator, and he also did some regressive hypnosis sessions with many people who claimed to have been abducted by aliens. So, and this is what he said at the time, according to the article that appeared in the National Enquirer. He says, "It is very difficult for people to lie under hypnosis. And when three people in separate hypnotic sessions all agree on the essential parts in their account, the chance they have lied is beyond all reasonable possibility. The three women, Elaine Thomas, Louise Smith, and Mona Stafford, have lived in and near Liberty, Kentucky most of their lives. Two are grandmothers, and the third, Mona Stafford, is the mother of a 17-year-old. They were returning from a late supper in Stanford, 29 miles from home, when their nightmare began at 11:30 p.m. last January 6th. Suddenly, a mile west of the city, a large disc-shaped object hurtled into view. It was big as a football field," recalled Louise, who was driving. "It was metallic gray with a glowing white dome, a row of red lights around the middle, and 3 or 4 red and yellow lights underneath. The UFO stopped ahead of them, then circled around behind their car. Suddenly, the auto picked up speed. Louise found that she could not control it. The speedometer registered 85 miles an hour. The others screamed to slow down, but I held my foot in the air to show them it wasn't even on the gas pedal," Louise said. "Then some awesome force began dragging the car backward, and at that point came the 80-minute gap in the trio's memories. Their next conscious memory was of seeing a street light as they entered Houstonville, 8 miles from where they'd seen the UFO. The frightened women immediately drove to Louise's home in Liberty. They should have arrived around midnight, but it was 1:25 a.m. An hour and 20 minutes, maybe longer, was missing. Time we couldn't account for," Louise said. "Louise's neck hurt, so she asked Mona to look at it. Mona found a strange red mark, like a fresh burn that hadn't blistered, 3 inches long and an inch wide. Elaine's neck had the same mark, and so did mine." So all three women had the same marks on their necks, the same red marks. The terrifying women summoned the next-door neighbor, and he told him, and they told him their story. He sent them into separate rooms to draw a sketch of the UFO. The drawings were almost identical. The red marks vanished 2 days later, but the hour and 20 minutes they'd lost continued to puzzle them until the Enquirer had them hypnotized on 2 separate occasions in July. Now, let me just stop here for a second. Now, you would think a story like this, these ladies weren't lying back then, but why is it the National Enquirer, a tabloid newspaper, regularly posting sensational stories, a lot of them filled with falsehoods throughout the years? But this story here, a lot of UFO stories, that was the one good thing about tabloid newspapers, especially throughout the 1970s and 1980s. This, at least they gave it some credence. They saw this was something that would sell their papers. This is the kind of stories when people were walking out of the grocery store, they would pick them up because they would see these headlines, and it was just, this is fantastic news, and it should be big. It should have been bigger news. It should have basically because it was stories like this were only appearing in publications like the Enquirer. People don't, they didn't really take them seriously as they should. I mean, this, if the New York Times or the Washington Post, if they were publishing stories like that, then people would take them more seriously. But the mainstream news publications, along with all of the mainstream news outlets, always, back then particularly, were treating all of these stories like jokes, and they didn't believe them. And of course, the scientific community was not on board at all at the time either. Only some people, a small group. Anyway, according to the article, it says, during the hypnotic sessions, all three vividly recalled what had happened to them from the time their car was pulled backward until they reached Houstonville. Elaine Thomas remembered lying on her back in a long, narrow incubator-like chamber while beings, dark figures, small, looked about 4 feet high, kept passing by and looking in at her. She said a blunt instrument was pressed hard against her chest, causing considerable pain. At the same time, something was encircling her throat, and each time she tried to talk, she was choked into silence. Elaine cried softly at times under hypnosis. Something is pressing on my throat, like hands, all over, all around. I see shadows as they pass by, pressure on my chest. They won't let me breathe. I can't get away. Louise Smith said she was in a hot, dark place, and something was placed over her face. She begged the beings to let her see them, and once she was allowed to look, but quickly closed her eyes because whatever she saw was frightening. Even under hypnosis, Louise can't remember what the beings looked like. Oh, yes, I've been there. I know what it's like to be afraid to look. I mean, that's how my experience was somewhat back in 1977. I had the blanket over my head. I knew there was something standing there. I knew it wasn't human, but there was no way I wanted to look at its face. And I did not dare pull that blanket down to look at its face. I did not want to look at it. I did not want to see it. I mean, when these kind of things are happening to you, I can tell you right now, the last thing you want to do is be face to face with something, an alien creature, or what I thought at the time was something right straight out of hell. You don't want to look at it. You really don't. The women did, though, remember what the creatures looked like as time went by. During their initial hypnosis sessions, they couldn't really remember, but Louise Smith actually did remember, and she actually added to, it was more than just silhouettes, what she saw. She saw many forms, but she was so frightened that she didn't keep her eyes open long enough to remember any details. But some months later, she was able to form a picture of her captors, of their appearance at the same time identical to the humanoids seen by her companions. She was able to add that their hands were indented or serrated, like the ends of a bird's wings. And there's an image, there was a drawing that she drew that shows this weird hooded creature with these slanted eyes and these hands that have jagged, looks like the ends of a jagged bird wings. That's what it looks like. Reliving her experience hypnotically, Louise gasped out, "Help me, Lord, please." She was sobbing. "It's so dark, I'm scared. Get that off my face. Let go of my arm. I want to get up, but I can't." At one point, she cried out, "Please, I can't do no more. I'm so weak. I want to die. Please don't." She was crying. "Don't touch me." And later she said under hypnosis, "Can I go home now? I'm going fast, so fast. I see a light. It's a street light." And by this point, under hypnosis, she was smiling. She was happy that the whole ordeal was coming to an end. Mona Stafford remembered lying on a bed in what seemed to be an operating room, her right arm pinned down by some invisible force, while 3 or 4 figures in white gowns sat around her bed. She doesn't recall their features. That's probably a good thing. Mona believed she was being tortured. She said that once her eyes felt as though they were being jerked out of her head, and another time her stomach felt as if it were being blown up like a balloon. "My head hurts, my eyes hurt so bad," she said. "I see an eye. It's kind of like crystal. It just burst out into light or something. My hand feels like it's tied down. It's hurting. It's numb." At one point she screamed, "Oh, he's coming at me. Oh, they're pulling at me. They're pulling my feet. My feet are being bent backward, twisted. I can't take no more." The women were given lie detector tests by Detective James Young, senior polygraph examiner for the Lexington, Kentucky Police Department and vice president of the State Polygraph Association. Afterward, Young said it in a signed statement, "It is my opinion that these women actually believe they did experience an encounter." And then, of course, Dr. Sprinkle, who hypnotized all 3 women twice, he said, "It is quite obvious these women have specific impressions which indicate to them that they were being observed and handled by strange beings. In my opinion, it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for these women to fake their impressions. The impressions during the loss of time experience are similar to those of other UFO witnesses who apparently have experienced abduction and examination." And of course, this story, I'm going to end that there. There's more to this article. I'm going to leave links. I want to say thank you to Jeff Knox, who on his regularly posts historic UFO cases on his Twitter feed. I will leave a link to this. He has numerous articles there from different people. One from Leonard Stringfield, another one from the APRO, So there's numerous reading material on this case. It's an amazing case. Obviously, these three women experienced something. They weren't lying. It's not something that they made a lot of money on, like some people might try to claim. They made nothing on this. They had this strange experience. With the UFO, they lost time. How many times have we heard stories like this? And it's just another case that proves. You look at this story. These women were not lying. This was something that really happened. They couldn't understand how they lost the time when they were hypnotized. They all remembered the same thing, very similarly to other cases. If you think about the Allagash 4, for instance, this is something that is real. It's something that's been happening for decades, and it's time that we, like I said, like I've been stating in a lot of my podcast recently, that this is something that we need to begin to take seriously, and we need to stop pretending that we don't know whether it's real or not. It's real. Anyway, I want to say thank you all for joining me. Until next time.